Thank you all for coming. Thank you all for being here. I welcome you to the Center for Development Research. This is actually the first of one of 5 sessions of an event that we have during the COP on biodiversity and ecosystems under climate change. Today will be on the topic of biodiversity and protected areas under climate change. We will have first 2 keynotes. First one will be by Professor Dr. Wilhelm Barthlott, and the second one by Koketso Sakhile from the Convention on Biological Diversity. And yes, so I will introduce now Professor Wilhelm Barthlott first. And he has been for more than 25 years a professor actually at the University of Bonn and the director of the NES Institute, which is an institute on plant biodiversity research. Since 2012 he's actually now retired, but he's still quite active, so that's also why we are happy to have him here today. And he has done a lot of research on biogeographic aspects of biodiversity, species distribution aspects and these things. So without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Wilhelm Barthlott to give this presentation. So we just have to switch something here very quickly.
We'll make it.
Yeah. Okay.
Very good.
Is that everything?
I hope so. So, thank you so much, Lisa. I did hesitate for a moment to come here because my work is not mainly concerned with climate impact. But after a few discussions and so on, I think it could be adequate. I have a number of slides which I will go through very fast. Biodiversity Today for Tomorrow was actually the title of a BION conference we had here in Bonn about 2 years ago, a network on biodiversity which is local here in, no, doesn't work, yes. So, basic facts. We agreed some basic facts at first. Biodiversity, you know all the numbers. Not quite sure is this number. 8 million as a minimum, so about 80 to 90% of animals and plants we don't know. But the number, according to very recent investigations coming from genetic biological information, might be much higher. 300 million is one of the numbers which is in discussion now. Anyway, it's the oldest part of science, but we know very little. So we have been interested, and Lisa Freudenberger mentioned it already, in the geographic distribution. We use plants. Plants are the only reliable basis because they are large. They don't run away, in contrast to insects. Yeah, and we know most of them. So this is actually a global biodiversity map of plants. The darker the color. Could we possibly? No, it's complicated.
Sure. No, we can do it.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
So the darker the color, yeah, the more species you have. Yeah, and it's based on plants. We'll never have a map on insects or whatever. But according to the relation between consumers, produce, and so on, this map reflects more or less the whole biodiversity. You see, it's no incident. The Convention on Biodiversity arose here, and not in Washington, D.C., or Moscow, or Novosibirsk. Yeah, it's the wealth of genetic resources. These are the 4 points I want to discuss. We are in the first point already, biological diversity. I'll show you a little case study of my own field, and globalization, and some a little bit unusual aspects at the very end, which I consider to be very important. So, at one hand, daily we discover new species. A new dragon tree on the Canary Islands 50 years ago. Nobody would have expected it. It's not only a tiny little aspect. So within one project in Bonn, yeah, we discovered 4 new dragon tree species in West Africa. Second point is organisms become extinct. Yeah? No numbers because we don't know the number, what becomes extinct daily. Yeah? However, it's an exponential curve, and I took the example of the elephant bird of Madagascar, which is a few hundred years ago, it disappeared. Third point is evolution. That's the most boring point concerning our questions. In the very limited range of time we consider, evolution is too slow. You will have an evolution maybe of varieties, subspecies, bacterial strains and so on, but no real biodiversity. That's very hard sometimes to explain to a general public, because they tell you, oh, extinction is normal, most organisms are extinct, true. But they forgot the time frame. So, next point is migrations. Neophytes, new species. If you look at a landscape or a meadow here in Central Europe, after the ice ages and Europe was recolonized, nothing is older than 12,000 years. And everything down here comes from the Near East, Iraq and Syria. Human influence. They are elements of our diversity. Yeah? But migration is, in my opinion, underestimated portion of biodiversity patterns and biodiversity changes, in particular today. You know this, Florida is an exotic zoo and botanical garden today, and even Germany. We have here in Bonn this wonderful parrot, yeah, in my garden even, I watch it sometimes. We have the tiger mosquito in southern Germany, actually, first findings in Bonn also. So we have an enormous increase, a dramatic change in the diversity by migration. So to summarize it, it's a question of globalization. Yeah? Globalization by definition standardizes and reduces diversity. If you think it over, it's by definition. Yeah? Globalization reduces diversity. Locally, diversity increases. And on a short term, on a long term, and globally, diversity decreases. And this applies also, there are very critical articles and books to other fields. So, to illustrate this, a picture around Bonn here on the Autobahn. If you look at the numbers, we have in the Federal Republic of Germany, depending on what you count, about 3,000 plant species naturally occurring. Yeah, 100%. But we have nothing almost is extinct in Germany, disappeared in Germany. Nothing is really extinct because they are all outside of Germany. But we have at least 400 invasive species. So you could argue Germany has a biodiversity of plants of 112%. More than we ever had in our history. More than we ever had in our history. The problem is complicated. I compared two states or country, Thuringia in eastern Germany, same size as Hawaii. It's wonderful to compare. Quantity, in this, you have approximately the same numbers of species. Yeah? But the basic difference. In Thuringia, you have no species which occurs only in Thuringia. In Hawaii, you have almost everything only occurring in Hawaii. This is a dramatic difference. Dramatic difference. The Earth Observatory Conference is finished at the moment, so it's quite interesting. And if you look with respect to the map I showed you first, are the top 10 regions, yeah, with highest diversity and the highest degree of endemism, which I don't want to declare now. Look, these are islands, these are mainlands. New Caledonia, Southern Africa, Polynesia, and so on and so forth. Islands play an important role, which is underestimated. So, I think I've done everything here. I show you with 5 slides a case study, yeah, my personal interest. I've been interested. I started with biodiversity, and later on I turned almost completely into biomimetics. That's why I hesitated a little bit. Yeah, we have been interested in surfaces over 20 years. A lotus flower. You can read up in the Bhagavad Gita that lotus repels water. So texts are which are 2,000 years old. But nobody took it serious. We took it serious, and here's the result. It's millions of dollars from the commercial input today in products which you know, yeah, an idea from biodiversity. So the point is, why I show you the example here, in particular here, in relation to biodiversity. If you want to learn something from nature, you have to look at specialized organisms. If you want to know the limits of a car, what you can build, this is a success. This is a game for a few insiders. But if you want to know the limits, what you can do with a car, look at this. So we looked at exotic species. I gave you some examples. Yeah, look, we looked at lotus flowers, we looked at this, they are highly interesting. This is particularly interesting from a biomimetics point. Look where they come from centers of biodiversity. Very, very simple why. The more species you have, the more specialized organisms you will have, and the higher is the selection. If you want to have a broad selection, go to a department store, and not to a tiny little shop around the corner. So these centers are crucial, and it's not only for bionics, it's for pharmacy, it's almost for everything concerning biodiversity. So we built up a large database over years, and Henning Sommer from CEF is involved, who will be here in a few minutes probably. He's going to pick up somebody from the airport. A large database on African plants. I think it's the largest database, really. Interesting pictures like this. I mean, 20 years ago, no German chancellor would have visited a biodiversity project. Now it's different. The climate has changed in this positive change. So, I show you 2 slides. Species numbers in sub-Saharan Africa, human impact, yeah, and now the Verschneidung, how would you say it?
The overlay.
The overlay, yeah, you see, here it happens, yeah, where with this we lose species. So if you are completely esoterical, and disregard all political constraints, you could do the following game. Yeah, species numbers of Africa. These are the existing protected areas, the real protected areas. 8% and so on of the surface. Yeah, 83%. If you could do it idealized, you could do this. 81%, 92% of all species, but a completely different setup, which is politically not feasible. Look at South Africa. Yeah, but at least we have the knowledge. We should be aware we have an enormous knowledge what happens. If it's feasible or not, it's a different question. So this is a quotation which really confirms this Globalization reduces diversity. I show the very now unpopular exponential curve. We all have no answer, and so I skip it of our growth. No matter what happens here, it's uninteresting. Only this is interesting for the next years. So results are manifold. One result is we need production of cereals, food, agriculture, very cheap. Yeah, large masses. We use standardized, globalized, uniform monoculture all over the world. That's reality. It's reality with all negative side effects, which I don't have to explain you, but it's a basis. Yeah. Again, I remind you, in particular with respect to the following picture, locally and short-term biodiversity increases. Globalization increases diversity. This is the paradox which many people don't understand. Long-term is negative. The global point is this: we have never had a richer Angebot in a supermarket. If you go to the next supermarket, our grandmother would have dreamt about it. It's wonderful, but it's the same tomato you would buy on a supermarket in Andalusia or in South Africa. It's the same chicken genetically you have in a breeding farm in South Africa and in China. It's incredible. Locally, it's wonderful. Globally, it's a complete disaster. Yeah, it's very hard to transmit to people because they think of the next supermarket, Aldi, and so on. It's a brave new word, you see. Okay, global warming. The map done by Henning Sommer from CEF, who will be here in a few minutes. He calculated a lot of scenarios. Here's a very modest one. It's only 1.8 degrees. Yeah, and it's 2000, I think now. 2100, here's the result. Losers, lower species, winners. That's the tendency. You could discuss it endless, but all simulations show the same tendency. The tendency is we are on the side of the winners, period, like almost always. Yeah, it depends on where you stand it. If you live in Novosibirsk, ultimately salad in your goal. Yeah, it depends on where you stand. Here you have a decrease. We are on the winners, yeah, the species-rich regions. Yeah, here you have the winners, and on the other hand, this is not by evolution. This is by migration. Migration is the key word, yeah, for this. On the other hand, I come back, yeah. Islands, you remember the pictures I showed you before, Hawaii and Turigia. Islands are a key, yeah. We did a rather large study some years ago on islands, and here comes the problem, yeah. Habitat destruction, climate change, sea level rise. I think sea level rise will be a most important, yeah, factor concerning the reduce of biodiversity. Think of Fiji, and not only. You could think of the Netherlands. They don't have very much biodiversity anymore. But however, yeah. So sea level rise is probably one of the most important factors we try to a little bit ignore. It's very unpleasant. Our children will not travel to the Maldives anymore to these coral reefs. My last point, yes, biodiversity, culture, ideologies. So, very short. We have an interesting other point. Yeah, I show you the Noah's Ark, an old story which you have in the Quran, you have in the Bible, you have in Hinduistic writings. It's very old, much older than the Old Testimony. Yeah, you have a tsunami, possibly. Yeah, and you have the idea of saving the creation. So I've been interested in the last years. We did a little book which was quite successful on plants of the Quran and of the Bible. World population 7.5 billion people. About 90% are religiously oriented. I'm not losing my concept. I know it's a natural science. I'm a scientist. And it has nothing to do with what I believe. Look at the news today, yesterday. Religion and culture determine, not we as scientists. So it's interesting, look at it. It's interesting. Laudato Si, the Pope, or the UNEP conference in Tehran last year on biodiversity, culture and religion. So anyway, even Bob May, the long-term president of the Royal Society, a convinced, confessioning atheist, claims maybe religion is the answer. It's one answer, we should not forget it. So the answer is not coming from science at all. It's coming from somewhere else. And that's why this general conference is so interesting, because it's an interface between science and politics and culture and so on. I'll show you one last example. I have a little granddaughter, Lina, 10 years, and she came to do, I helped her with her geography, biology at school, capitals of Europe. And I asked her, what is the capital of Switzerland? And she thought over very long. And then she said, I don't know, but Switzerland is not in Europe. I was not shocked. But she was very, very firm. Very firm. If I would ask you, what is the longest river in Europe? Do you know? Danube? Ridiculous. Volga. What is the largest city in Europe? Do you know? Istanbul and Moscow. Everybody answers Paris, New York. Istanbul, 65% of the European continent. Yeah? So, watch up, watch up. This is a school book map by the EU, but it doesn't say. Kids do not know. They learn geography of Europe. Lake, lake, lake. Soon the British Islands will sink into the anyway, my final slide. Biodiversity today in a changing way. Scientists provide information, procedures, technologies and recommendations for action. But culture, education, ideology, religion, emotion and so on decide, not we. So education is everything. Thank you.
Just a second, we will have a panel discussion later on, but if there are any questions that are directly related to the presentation, you can also ask them now. If not, keep them for the panel discussion. No? Okay, then, thank you very much. I'll now introduce the next speaker. Yes, sure. Who is Koketso Sakhile from the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity. She is a program officer there since 2010. And she is an environmental scientist with more than 18 years of experience in climate change, mitigation, adaptation, biodiversity conservation, and sustainable use. And she's actually responsible to develop and implement program plans for climate change of the CBD, and she provides technical support to the countries and the national governments to identify and monitor the impacts of climate change and to develop also policy measures to address those. So she will give our next keynote, and after this we will come to our panel discussion. So thank you very much. Yeah. I just want to speak, okay.
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you, everybody. I'm not sure how I can follow such a very interesting presentation. Hopefully you stay awake long enough to get to the end of my little speech. So, CBD, conventional biological diversity. Why is the conventional biological diversity at the climate change COP? Why are we interested in climate change? Obviously because climate change has an impact on biodiversity, ecosystems, and actually on the livelihoods of people who depend on biodiversity. It's true that I am responsible for the program of work on climate change and biodiversity of the CBD Secretariat, but actually the conventional biological diversity deals with the issue of climate change across all of its programs. Climate change is a cross-cutting issue, and so this morning I am actually representing the Protected Areas team, who have also a very big program on climate change and how protected areas and climate change interrelate. And so we also have a very big program of work on marine and coastal biodiversity, and there's a lot of work that's going on in that regard. And so if you want more information, I can give you my card or something, and then we can exchange it. So not to bore you any longer. Representative, well-connected, effectively and equitably managed protected area networks can play a key role in minimizing climate change impacts on terrestrial and marine ecosystems, and also provide a cost-effective option to implement climate change response strategies. The effective implementation of Aichi Biodiversity Target 11 can produce a win-win scenario with multiple benefits, including in this case climate change mitigation, adaptation, and the protection of biodiversity. I just want to pause and find out if everybody knows what I'm talking about when I say Aichi Biodiversity Target 11. So, the Convention on Biological Diversity is overseen by the Conference of the Parties. Conference of the Parties meets every 2 years to decide on the program of action for the convention. In 2010, the Conference of the Parties, sort of like the Conference of the Parties here for the Climate Change Convention, they adopted a 10-year strategic framework to guide the work of the convention. The strategic framework has 5 goals, ranging from addressing the underlying causes of biodiversity loss, some of which the professor already mentioned here, and then going all the way to public awareness, science, and actually policy. Target 11, so those 5 goals have 20 targets underlying them. And these are global targets, and countries have to create national targets for action in the framework of those 20 targets. Target 11 of those targets talks about protected areas. Talks about increasing the global extent of protected areas from terrestrial protected areas from 10% to 17%, and then marine protected areas from 6% to 10%. So, and then the target doesn't only talk about the extent, it talks about representativity, connectivity, and also management effectiveness. And so all the things that the professor showed on his few slides on protected areas. So this is what that target talks about. It also talks about integrating protected areas in wider landscapes and seascapes, so that they're not isolated islands of conservation, but actually integrated into the wider landscape and seascape. So I think now you know what Target 11 is about. So if we implement Aichi Target 11, we can produce win-win scenarios. In particular, with relation to climate change mitigation, protected areas can contribute to effective climate change mitigation by actually avoiding ecosystem degradation, which results in increased greenhouse gas emissions, but also helping to sequester carbon and to store it. This is important as ecosystem degradation and loss are one of the main causes of greenhouse gas emissions. Effectively managed protected areas can slow down or reverse such degradation and loss. In terms of adaptation to climate change, protected areas can contribute to adaptation and resilience to the impacts of climate change by protecting and maintaining ecosystem integrity, buffering local climate change impacts, and reducing risks from extreme events such as storms, droughts, and sea level rise. They maintain essential ecosystem services to help cope with changes in fisheries, water supplies, and agricultural productivity. By buffering the impact of climate change, effectively manage protected areas and marine protected areas, strengthen adaptive capacity and resilience, and serve as risk management tools, among many others. So I talked about Aichi Target 11, Aichi Biodiversity Target 11. When the Aichi Biodiversity Targets were adopted, countries had the obligation to set national targets that would feed in. So we would aggregate national targets at national level, national action, and try to get global results. One of the biggest programs under that was the development of protected areas action plans, or what they called Aichi Biodiversity Target Action Plans. So this is one of the more mature areas of work under the CBD Secretariat. Protected area, Aichi Biodiversity Target 11 action plans. Many countries have actually developed those. They've identified what the gaps are in their protected area networks, what are the issues relating to management effectiveness, representativity, and connectivity. And they've put forward some sort of actions that they want to put into place to address those issues. So the important role of protected areas for climate change mitigation and adaptation has been recognized in the national priority actions submitted by parties to achieve Aichi Biodiversity Target 11. So for example, Papua New Guinea plans to identify the importance of mitigation through maintaining intact forests and reducing the impact of sea level rise along coastlines by maintaining natural vegetation, while Nepal will restore degraded forest ecosystems, rangelands, and wetland habitats, and also promote conservation-friendly management of forests. Given the importance of protected areas in biodiversity conservation and ecosystem resilience, their use should constitute an explicitly recognized component of an adaptation strategy for addressing the impacts of climate change. It's now recognized widely that the return on investment in protected areas is generally very high. So if anybody wants to argue with these figures, don't talk to me. I'll put you in touch with our protected areas team. This is their work. But for example, in Vietnam, the planting of about 12,000 hectares of mangroves at a cost of $1.1 million has led to savings of approximately $7.3 million per year in dike maintenance, while also providing protection against typhoons. As per Article 5 of the Paris Agreement, parties should take action to conserve and enhance as appropriate sinks and reservoirs of greenhouse gases. Does everybody understand what sinks and reservoirs are? Yes?
I think so, yes.
Protected areas are an effective means to make this happen. There are links between protected areas, biodiversity conservation, and intended nationally determined contributions of many parties to this UNFCCC. For example, Belize, in its nationally determined contribution, aims to protect forest reserves and ensure sustainable forest management and to protect and restore mangrove forests, while Nepal plans to maintain 40% of the country under forest cover. Expanding the coverage of protected areas, enhancing its elements, so ecological representation, areas important for biodiversity, connectivity, corridors, And achieving IT Biodiversity Target 11 would lead to multiple invaluable benefits as natural solutions to human well-being, socioeconomic growth, and development. Increased income opportunities and poverty eradication, food and water security, climate change mitigation and adaptation, and disaster risk reduction. And so, I guess the important question that we have from the CBD is how can we communicate this better? I mean, this is work that is going under the CBD on protected areas, well recognized under the CBD, but how do we communicate this to the climate change world? And yeah, that's where I want to leave my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Are there any directly related questions? Otherwise, I think, yes, there's one.
I would have one probably, and this is connecting actually the two presentations. So you showed this map about alternative protection areas which maximize biodiversity. And you have been talking about maximizing also positive outcomes in terms of ecosystem-based adaptation or mitigation. Is it possible to deliver maps or information materials which could inform decision makers about how protected areas can be actually placed in order to reach best outcomes in terms of different goals, and how those targets could be actually aligned to have the best outcome in terms of joint objectives?
So you were asking Ms. Koketso Sakhile, right?
So I don't think the problem is the creation of the maps. I think that especially at the rough scale, at a rough global scale, you can produce those maps. In fact, we did that in 2011 with funding from the IKI. We produced an online tool. I think the problem is communicating that tool, or getting that tool to be used by the people who matter, or communicating the results of that tool. So we did a tool that showed the carbon density of protected areas globally, and the tool was supposed to communicate how important protected areas are for reaching climate change mitigation goals, and also showed areas that would benefit from a carbon perspective, or better protection, or better management, or better integration into wider landscape and seascape. And basically that project has kind of slowly and quietly died because nobody used that information beyond the CBD secretariat actually. So yeah, I think the problem is communication, or identifying what those people need to hear and then providing it in the format that they need to hear it.
Okay, so maybe we should start with our panel discussion, and I invite, sorry, you want to say something as well? Sorry.
Yeah.
I didn't want to cut you off.
You are absolutely right. The information is available and it's published. But the problem is not communication. The problem is acceptance. We learned this earlier, in different fields. Communication is clear, but decision makers are under different constraints, and you can communicate. You talk against a blank wall.
Okay, I think this actually already delivers us some point for discussing. So I would invite all the panelists to come to the front, and I'll maybe start by introducing them. So Professor Wilhelm Barthlott, maybe you come to the front first. I already introduced you, and Ms. Koketso Sakhile. And then I would also invite Dr. Schmitt to the front. She's a senior researcher and project coordinator at CEF since 2013. She has worked on tropical forest biodiversity and protected areas, or she's working on that. She did her PhD on floristic diversity in the Ethiopian wild coffee forest, actually here at CEF. Then she left CEF for a while to go to Freiburg, where she received her habilitation in 2015 from the University of Freiburg on landscape management and nature conservation, where she also worked as an assistant lecturer. Now she works on various aspects of tropical forest biodiversity protected areas, as well as climate change mitigation. So welcome, Christine Schmitt. Then I would like to invite Dr. Elke Mannigel to the front. She's representing the NGO Verde here today, where she's a coordinator for international projects. Verde is an NGO working towards the protection of the most diverse but also most threatened ecosystems. They have actually successfully established a number of protected areas, for example in Honduras, Cuba and Indonesia. And they are conducting environmental education programs in Germany and tropical countries, and have established an education center in Venezuela. Welcome. Then I would like to invite Raza Rizvi to the front. He's from IUCN, and he's a program manager there in the Global Ecosystem Management Program, working in Washington, D.C. He has over 20 years of professional experience in promoting environmental conservation and human well-being, and he is with IUCN since 1994. Before he was actually the head of Climate Change and Resilience Program, and now he works on biodiversity and species issues, coastal and marine aspects, environmental economics and disaster risk reduction. Welcome. And then I also invite Ms. Cordula Epple to the front. She is from UNEP WCMC, the World Conservation Monitoring Center. She's a senior program officer there for climate change and biodiversity, and has been since 2010. She coordinates and works on a variety of projects about the relationship of biodiversity and climate change. And before she actually worked for the German government for the Federal Agency for Nature Conservation on also biodiversity and climate change related issues. So all welcome, and now I'm also taking my seat. So I just want to point out that this is an open discussion, so I want you all to just say, maybe not interrupt, but also oppose if you think of something differently. So not to make me ask questions and you just answer, and to make this a little bit flexible. Okay, so but maybe we start with you, Professor Barthlott, first. So we heard actually already a lot about the impacts of climate change and biodiversity, but what do you think is like the most threatening aspect of climate change for biodiversity? What's the most important aspect? How would you summarize it?
Sea level rise.
The sea level rise?
Yeah, invasion of species.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so these two aspects.
Change of condition, but it's too complicated to answer it in.
Yeah, I think we actually saw that in your presentation, that it was quite complicated, and since it is so complicated, it's of course also quite complicated to model it. And so I would actually give this question to you, Dr. Schmitt. What do you think are the greatest challenges when actually modeling climate change impacts? I mean, there are different ones, but what would you say are the biggest challenges, and what makes it so difficult to actually know what's happening?
Well, it's very complicated. Yeah, I think, well, the biggest challenges, I mean, if you say model climate change on biodiversity, first, I mean, there are certain challenges in the climate change models themselves, because I think we can quite easily predict different levels of temperature increase, or we can have different scenarios for that. But for example, modeling future precipitation patterns is even more complicated than that. And for individual species, it's not the annual amount of precipitation, but it's also the pattern of precipitation, whether they have a long or a short rainy season, whether you have extreme weather events or like normal conditions throughout the year. And there is a lot of uncertainty in this, and this uncertainty also affects the models. And then talking about the species, of course, I mean, in order to know the climate change effects, you need to know the ecological amplitudes of the species. And I think in the temperate zones, we already have quite a lot of species information, but especially in the tropics, I mean, for some species, we barely know their distribution patterns, and we don't really know their ecological characteristics. And then, as we heard, migration is very important, but for many species, we don't know their speed of migration, their migration patterns. That also depends on the landscape metrics, and then, they start taking into account a lot of different different factors which make the model very complicated and also uncertain.
Okay.
And then also probably we would have to model novel ecosystems with new species compositions, and we don't know the future species interactions.
Okay.
So I think it's quite easy. I mean, to make global maps that give some certain indication, but if you really want to model what's going to happen in a particular region, that's still complicated.
Yeah.
And that's also because we heard about like communicating with policymakers or to the general public. I mean, if it's so complicated, people stop listening, or it's very difficult to communicate those uncertainties or their implications.
Does that mean we shouldn't do it anymore if it's so uncertain?
No, I think that's education. I think we should continue doing that, but we also need to be aware maybe that we need to choose a different language when talking to people.
Okay. Sorry, I think you want to say something first, you as well.
I was just going to add to the complexity, because obviously we also have to think about how humans are going to change their strategies in dealing with climate change. So on top of all this really difficult to model species reactions and species interactions as they react to climate change, we also have to overlay this with efforts to mitigate climate change, which are going to have a huge impact on land use, and also efforts to adapt to climate change. So we're really reaching a degree of complexity that is extremely difficult to handle. So, I can only support what Christina says. It's very hard to give simple messages about this.
Yeah, I would just like to point out the elephant in the room. That is that in the climate change international discourse, biodiversity has not been there. For 22 years we've been discussing policy instruments and all this, and it's very recent. The word biodiversity was not there. It was, it's not our cup of tea. CBD, others, they need to, deal with it. So unless and until we will break the silos, we will keep, talking to the same choir, and biodiversity would keep suffering. So that's critical to build the linkages, and the UNFCCC processes, they need to know how, if we want human well-being, sustainable development, we cannot achieve it without investing into biodiversity. And the same way in the CBD, climate change and other thing got recognized and coming into forefront. They're coming slowly. Sakhile is playing a very critical role in all this, but we need to break these silos, because then donors, they have different windows to fund these investment plans. And then again, when the biodiversity project is being implemented, climate change comes somewhere back in we need to climate proof somewhere, but still those mechanisms are not in place. And then invasive species are coming up because of climate change and all that, and that's again a big challenge. Nobody has any easy answers how to deal with that invasive species, which the process has been being further reinforced by climate change. So those are the things we cannot do business as usual. But in both the sectors, sorry to say, experts are doing business as usual most of the time. So we need to get out of it and link UNFCCC with CBD, and also from policy to practice also. So I'll stop here, come back again.
Thank you, Sakhile.
So I agree with what Ali is saying, and just back to the issue of linking that back to the issue of the models. I think that for Rio +20 and also for the 4th Global Biodiversity Outlook, they did run some models that show that pathways for sustainability do exist. So my question is, do we need to get the models right, or do we just put the wheels on the car while we're driving it? Do we not use cost scale information that could give us indications, sort of feel our way through the corridor in the dark, and then, as we become more certain or as we become more able or as we see how things are actually shaping up, do we not at least try to use that information? And I think that the models that we have do show that sustainable development, so sustainable pathways exist to achieving the 2050 biodiversity vision, at the same time as achieving, at that point, they were looking at the 2-degree goal, but also meeting food security goals. And so I just want to say that, sometimes we try to perfect the science, but it's not always necessary to do that. We just could also use what science has already told us already, and then build on that.
So kind of managing the unknowable things. Okay. You want to say
just from the practice side of the things, because we are actually doing projects in tropical forest conservation with all the uncertainties and without knowing all the numbers and all the models. And I think that's very important that we don't wait until we get all the facts right. We have to act now. And the good thing is that we have a whole lot of diversity as well in the approaches that we use. So protected areas is not one protected areas, it's like the other protected areas. You have national parks, core zones, which you don't use, which are no-take zones. But you also have sustainable landscapes that are protected areas where you want to have more sustainable agriculture, where you want to have more ecological agriculture. So I think there's a whole bunch of instruments that you can use to protect biodiversity within protected areas. But the next part of the conservation on biodiversity is as well the sustainable use. So you have a lot of aspects as well that you can change the way we do agriculture. For example, the monoculture that we saw in the picture, there's a lot of increasing agricultural biodiversity, which helps us to increase biodiversity, to conserve biodiversity, but as well as adapting to climate change, for example, which is very important. For me, one of the biggest challenges is that you mentioned that implementing protected areas or implementing ecosystem-based adaptation is actually reducing costs in many ways, or is getting a good return on investments. Nevertheless, what we see is that we don't get that in money, really. That's one of the biggest challenges, to have that somehow expressed in financial money that gets to the project and that really finance protected areas. A lot of protected areas that we have do not finance themselves, are not managing to get the finance from the governments or from other areas that they need to be protected and provided.
Okay.
So I think for me that's one of the challenges.
Yes.
Yeah, if I can just say, I didn't want to argue that we first need to get the models right, and then we can start doing conservation. Not at all. I think these are two parallel processes. It's good to be working on the models also from a scientific point of view, and at the same time, we need to be doing something on the ground. And I think that the models even indicate, since people, and also species will migrate due to climate change, it's very important not only to have area-based conservation, but also to develop the landscape, to develop corridors. I think you mentioned that already, and consider the wider landscape, and to create landscape that enable species to migrate where they need to. Yeah.
Okay. I have a question. The thing is that climate change is changing the composition of the species. They are migrating, and we are establishing protected areas which are basically not very flexible, right? They are protecting a certain area, and we can't really predict how this area will change. We are trying to, but it's very uncertain. And I'm just wondering if it makes sense to have this very static concept of protected areas in times of climate change, or if we need to maybe think about alternatives, or what are your thoughts about this? Is this still the right way to go, to say we establish protected areas and we need more money maybe for this? Should we maybe protect even those areas that are not so vulnerable to climate change because they are more likely to be still there under future climate change? Yeah. What are... if you want to start? Yeah, sure.
For me, protected areas is not so much it's a very flexible tool. And I
Okay.
don't think it's just a one size fits it all solution, but you have all the different varieties of protected areas that you can work with all the different concepts of restrictions or sustainable use and promotion of sustainable use. And that I think is a very flexible tool. We are also working a lot on the buffer zone of protected areas, which I think is quite important. That they are not like islands in a sea of destruction or monoculture. As Christina said, you have to walk in corridors connecting the different protected areas, which for me is part of the protected area concept, to work in the wider landscape and not only in the islands of the protected areas, which might be a national park or something where you have to have very strict conservation measures. For me, I think protected areas developed a lot over time, and also in the governance issues where you had in the beginning only the governments that established protected areas, but now you have a lot of traditional and local communities that are establishing protected areas as well. And I think we have to move to a much broader concept of protected areas. We have been moving and are still moving to broaden that, and for me it's still a good instrument.
Yeah, my take on this is that, it deserves the question you posed. We need to revisit the boundaries of, those protection, whatever under, governance regimes, different protected areas are, because things have changed. Species are migrating. The reason those protected areas were declared protected areas, in many cases those species are not there. So if we will stick to the same principles, we need to, that's what the world is changing. So because of climate change, so we need to change our modus operandi accordingly. Those cannot be static, and whatever other regimes are, those need to be revisited, because unless and until we will do that, we might be protecting in those areas which might not have that value. Protected areas have played a critical role, but now the pressures and all those, and the communities who are living around them, they also are more dependent to go into those areas who are protected. But at the same time, let's not forget the fact that out of all the protected areas, half do not have management plans. Half of those who have management plans, they don't get implemented. They don't have resources. In developing countries, out of those which have management plans and other they don't have the capacities or that level. They might have vehicles, but fact is they might not have petrol to run those vehicles. So there are many governance issues and other issues which need to take into account while we are looking into those. They should continue playing that effective role. That's changing, and then we need to invest accordingly. Because in bits and pieces, there are wonderful, science and other things, they are playing a role. But we need to see if that's theoretical or it's also happening on ground. If we do economic valuation of a protected area, TEEB and other studies, you will look into that $10 billion per annum of this protected area. And in developing countries, if you go over there, poorest of the poor, they live around those protected area. So who's getting these benefits of $10 million per year of those protected areas? How would we have equity and other thing? So those are critical. Sometimes we just get carried away. This protected area, wonderful, those many, but then poorest of the poor, they live over there. So what is going wrong here? So this, and then climate change is all impacting it a bit more. So that's what, I think the young generation who is the target or in this room, they need to play a role, because perhaps we got so much into doing business as usual, so we hide behind those. You people need to do and make us aware and do new things. That is what is needed in this, and this question does need a lot of thinking and studies.
So you would actually maybe also argue for not protecting certain areas anymore that have been protected under the current.
Yeah, under protected areas playing a critical role, no doubt about it. That's wonderful. But at the same time, we have done a lot of mistakes also. Indigenous people, their rights and other things, so which now being recognized, those were pushed out of in the name of biodiversity. Now we have learnt our lessons, and now they are part and parcel of management plans. But at the same time, we need to see the reason they were declared protected. Is that reason exist? Are the critical species or critical species? Most of the elephants I know in Sri Lanka and elsewhere, they live outside protected area. Most of these other species which are endemic, they are no more in those protected boundaries. So, we need to now come back and revisit all these challenges and then see how best we can still protect in all those. There are critical ecosystems which need to be protected. And the rest, biosphere reserves and all this, so their boundaries and other things can be revisited to look into those benefits.
Please.
Yeah, so I mean, this is interesting. When I saw the professor's slide about where protected areas should be, there would be no protected areas in Botswana, where I come from. And currently the country has, under the various models of protection, about 47% of protection. So it is an important question. What are we protecting? I think in the context of climate change, when we talk about protected areas, there's three things to look at. It's management effectiveness. Ali already spoke about that. Connectivity, right? The lady already spoke about. And then there's also resilience. It's important that in order for protected areas to continue to do what they do, that we reduce the external anthropogenic pressures on ecosystems. So pollution, over-extraction, and all these other things. Those three things would help protected areas stand up a little bit better against the pressures of climate change. And I agree with, I don't know, Doc, just to your right. But I agree with you what you said about protected areas come in all shapes and forms, and sometimes you don't even need the thing to be called a protected area for it to serve the purpose of a protected area. In South African legislation, they have a suite of environmental management acts. So they have the overarching Environmental Management Act, it's called NEMA, and then they have National Environmental Management Biodiversity Act, National Environmental Management Protected Areas Act. And read together, these three acts, they give the minister the power to declare areas such as special environmental management areas. And in a special environmental management area, the minister can actually prohibit certain activities from taking place. It could be protected from, for example, extraction, could be protected from pollution. And when you look at the maps, for example, in South Africa, climate change shows that biomes are shifting, east. And so, for example, your iconic protected areas like the Kruger National Park will not be useful for protecting the species that it's trying to protect. But in a country like South Africa, where 86% of the land is in private hands, how are you going to increase your protected area? So what then you can do is talk to the minister and ask the minister to declare some of these areas as special biodiversity areas, as special environmental management areas, and encourage the use of sustainable practices. In fact, climate change in South Africa is going to have a very big impact on the Cape Floristic Kingdom. And protected areas are not going to do anything to help that area. But what the city of Cape Town is doing, it has mapped the biodiversity in the city, and it's actually working. I used to live in a neighborhood where they had mapped all the important species in the Cape Floristic Kingdom in that area, and the city had actually promulgated regulations on what you could do and couldn't do in order to protect that floristic kingdom. So yeah, protected areas come in all shapes and forms, and they do remain important.
Okay.
Yeah.
We also heard a lot about that we actually have to look at these win-win areas where we can do something for climate change in terms of sinks and sources for carbon, and where we can do something for biodiversity. Now, if we look at this overlay of these maps, many of those areas can actually be found, especially in developing countries. So a question I would have to you is, well, if we find them mainly in developing countries, is that then should these areas be protected, and so that this is mainly the responsibility of those developing countries? Or do you disagree with that? Who has an opinion on that? maybe you? Yeah, you.
Yeah, I mean, I can start. I think what I like about the CBD is that each country has its national responsibilities, and I think that's all. I think it's too easy to say that just a few number of countries that host a big species diversity, that they are responsible for biodiversity conservation, and the other countries can forget about it. I think that's too easy an answer, because biodiversity is not only about species richness, it's also about particular species, it's about special ecosystems and so on. So I think that every country needs to do an effort to conserve the biodiversity within its borders. And then of course, I mean, I think there is general acceptance that the developed countries need to help the developing countries in meeting their biodiversity conservation goals.
Okay.
I think, talking about the win-win situation, I mean, I think you all know about REDD+, reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. And in the beginning, I mean, everyone was quite happy and thought, this is an easy solution. We just protect the rainforests and the carbon that they store, and at the same time, we also protect species diversity, and it's a great win-win situation. But again, it's more complicated than that, because the level of carbon storage varies, even in the tropics, even the species diversity varies a lot, and also it's quite expensive. And till today, I think that financing this idea is a big problem.
So it's money, basically.
Yeah.
One of the issues.
One of the issues.
Okay. You want to say something?
Yeah, well, we are a German non-governmental organizations working for tropical forests, which in Germany we don't have tropical forests. So why are we doing that? For us, we have a lot of things that we use from tropical forests in Germany. As you saw in the presentation from Professor Barthlott, he said as well that there are a lot of things we can learn from tropical biodiversity. There's a lot of daily products that we use from tropical forests. They help us to mitigate climate change. So it's important for us as well here in Germany that tropical forests are conserved, are intact. The other thing is that there are a lot of things as well that we do here that impact tropical forests. And it's not so much about protected areas, but about biodiversity in general, that we have a lot of products that we consume, or a lot of things we do here in Germany that have impacts on other countries. For example, we use a lot of palm oil in all the different products from the supermarket. We use it as a biofuels as well, which impacts greatly in other countries on their biodiversity. We also have the meat production in Germany, which is quite big and depends on soy that is imported from Brazil, from the Amazon region. So there are a lot of things that have a huge impact on tropical forests, and that's why we work on education here in Germany as well. And I think that's a responsibility that we have as industrialized countries as well, to see what are our impacts in other countries and how do we contribute to biodiversity loss as well in other countries. And therefore I think it's very, very important that we also engage in conserving biodiversity in the other countries as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Any other thoughts about this?
Yeah, take forward, biodiversity agenda and other, and especially as per your question, developing countries, issues that we cannot see and resolve issues in vacuum. If there is poverty, people will going from indigenous plants or whatever for commercial plantation and all this. The demand in China, for example, for meat, many countries in Africa and other in Asia, they are converting their lands and all these areas and going for that fodder and other thing which will help to have meat available to 2 billion people almost, India and China, to have that available. Everything has a trade-off. When we say win-win, my take after 22 years is there's no such thing as win-win. There is always a trade-off. We need to minimize the damage on local ecosystems and do that. But biodiversity conservation, if we keep thinking it will happen in poverty and people all this, it will not happen. We need to look at, that's why SDGs now is a new hope. Hopefully they will not be a fad, and again, like other things will go away with time. But all these things need to be interconnected, and then we see how are the market forces, how those are impacting biodiversity, because we are having state-of-the-art research. We have really great models, but when it comes to implementation, policies become legal things and there's no enforcement. And then there are market forces which, countries keep changing their priorities. So all these things need to be linked and see holistically, which is a big challenge. No easy answers. I appreciate and understand those. But without taking those into consideration, we might go into circles and all this keep repeating the mistakes.
Okay. I would like actually to open the floor also to questions from the audience. So, do we have any questions? No? No one? Okay. Please, Suleiman.
Thank you very much. And sorry to be late. I just came from traveling. It's really interesting, this question, because we are talking about the connection between climate change and biodiversity, and I think Professor Barthlott also stated something which is important, which is also population growth. Because you have three key elements: the size of the population and the resource used by the population, which is increasing, becoming very high, and we are also a protected area. By IUCN target, we want to increase the surface of protected area, and we have a climate change which is coming. How can we combine all these things? Because I would say it's even Malthusian situation, because it cannot sustain, because we are protecting the area, but the population is increasing and the demand is increasing. And this is not possible. We will have an antagonistic relationship. So I think the best way is to revise our way of thinking protected area. Because I work at IUCN for 1 year as a coordinator of PAPACO. And the lesson I learned is that we have to transform our vision of protecting with a new vision, which is a synergetic vision living with the protected area, because it will not work like that. And the landscape approach of conservation, to me, can merge all these things. Meaning that we should not just have a place for biodiversity, we will be part of biodiversity, and we try to, and this is based on what Professor Barthlott said, it's based on the education, because the new human population should think differently in terms of consumption, in terms of also biodiversity. I think it's really something, it's a big challenge, and because if you look the scenario of IPCC, you will reach the 2 degrees, this is sure. And it will be a catastrophe. So we have really to think a new way of thinking about the protection of biodiversity and also our economy and all these things. But this have to start really with the education, I think. Okay. But it's really a nice discussion, and the solution I
think
yes, thank you very much for all the discussion so far. I was wondering if we can also talk about the 2/3 of the planet that are covered by oceans and marine protected areas, and if you have some reflections on these. Some of us came from another session on EBA, where countries don't want to be called small island development states anymore, but large marine or ocean states here, large ocean states, which I like very much actually. And for them, when you're talking about protection area, you're talking about thousands of square kilometers, you're talking about really big areas. And I was wondering if some of the panelists can reflect back in terms of modeling, in terms of implementation, in terms of lessons that can be learned from the terrestrial part on the management of these protected areas, and how do they help solve the migration of species issues that you were also talking about.
Yeah. Question? Who would like to answer? Anyone? Anyone would like to say something about marine?
Yeah, marine again, there are challenges. We do need to, but the amount of plastic and other, the whole new issue, which initially for IUCN was also something, should we get into plastic and something, because we are traditionalist, biodiversity conservation, all this. So yeah, we need to change that, because now we have a full-fledged program which is dealing with oceans, especially with the plastic, all the waste which is going into that. And again, with the large ocean states and the challenges they face in the, face of this climate change, where some islands, they are buying, land, Kiribati in Fiji or Australia, New Zealand. So there are challenges, and marine protected areas can play a critical role. But what's happening now, indigenous communities, for example, in Asia, Africa, they knew what is happening in climate change for centuries in a way. They have to keep changing with weather. But now the coping mechanisms are not keeping in pace their local abilities. So same in the marine areas, they have been facing surges and all that, and storm surges, and mangroves and other coastal areas play a role. But marine protected areas, all this, what's happening in the whole mangroves development, I know in one port development in in Thailand, having an impact in Cambodia, 150 miles away. Whole sand regime got changed, they are getting sand accumulation. Same is happening in Pacific Islands in many cases. What's happening in Hawaii, impacting Marshall Islands and other things. So having protected area is one thing, but at the same time, implementation of whatever the reasons are there, having right investment, it's not there. So increasing the size, as you also said, it's good goal, but having investment into that, with islands having those problems which they find, and let's be very clear, mangroves, if we start protecting, they take at least 10 to 20 years, to save lives. If you ask me to put my family behind a mangrove when a cyclone is coming, I won't do it. So let's be very clear, do we have the right science, to tell us what should be the depth of the mangrove and the size of the mangrove? Japan is the most prepared country in the world in disaster management. Within 10 minutes, everybody knew that tsunami is coming. And people who got panicky were saved. 18,000 people died who thought they will be saved by the information they have, because the wave, instead of 30 meters, was 40 meters. So we still don't have those things which will help, but now Japan is one of that case. They are working in Pacific Islands and all this, having some early warning system together with protected areas. So that is the key. Together with the soft solutions, we need to have technology. Then things will work out. Otherwise, just thinking in isolation, this one thing will help marine protected area, island states, it won't. We need to have together with poverty reduction, other things, and then also technology to go with it.
Thank you. Anyone else who would like to say something?
Maybe just a quick reflection on what you said with regard to designing protected area or finding the right type of protected area system. I think the basic things that we need to work on that Sakhile mentioned from IG Target 11 are exactly the same in the marine realm. They just play out differently, like in terms of if we look at connectedness and representativity. We need those things exactly in the marine realm just as we need them on land, but they work very differently because, connectedness in the marine realm is linked to ocean currents, and this might change very unpredictable. On land, we know what we need to connect. We know that we need to connect our protected areas uphill if we want to allow for species migration. We know that we need to allow for migration towards the north. In the marine realm, it's quite hard to predict how currents are going to change, and some things might be a lot more complicated, but I think the basic tasks as set out in IG Target 11, I think they are what we need to aim for in order to climate-proof protected area systems, and also to help them to design them so that they can help us adapt also for human populations. I think that's, but obviously it's because of the nature of marine systems, implementing it is very different.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions from the audience? Yes, please.
I'm glad that you brought up the Red Plus example. I just want to mention, for instance, that this was one of the ideas that tried to achieve many dispersed goals in one program, and there was a lot of hope, and there's still hope. I don't think that the main, of course, funding is one of the big issues, but I think one of the main issues with Red Plus was acceptance. And it's a very logical, very, how to say, it's got procedures, it's got everything very clear, but it comes with a package, and it's also a political issue. There's a past of colonization, there's a past of imposition, there's a past of extractivism, and for many people in the tropics, this means like it's a conscious washing, so it's just a payback for all destruction that happened before. And I think that the idea of trying to find what are the sources of authority, what are the actors that people listen to. Of course, it cannot happen with poverty. Biological conservation cannot happen in poverty, but there are people listen to some people. Maybe it's religion, maybe it's telenovelas in Mexico or in different. Maybe it has to come from different sources that people listen to. So my question is: have you identified, or is part of your respective areas of work to identify the sources of legitimation of conservation?
Maybe I give it to you first.
Well, I can say, for example, I was working on a number of projects where we tried to emphasize biodiversity conservation under REDD+, because the synergies don't come so easily. I mean, carbon is just a simple unit, and to the climate, it doesn't really matter if you conserve a unit of carbon in a temperate forest or in a tropical forest, but of course species diversity can be very different. So we were also, and then we were thinking, it's not the scientists that implement REDD+, but it's the politicians. So what do they think biodiversity is about? And we made interviews in Kenya and in Peru, and it turned out that those people at the policy level involved with REDD+, when they thought about biodiversity, they were thinking about things they can use. I mean, the ecosystem services provided by certain species. And it was great to see that in their REDD+ programs they were taking into account biodiversity, but it was biodiversity that is of benefit to them. And that, of course, is also, is some legitimation. I mean, you want to conserve what you can use, but in terms of, conservationists, it's only a small part of the biodiversity that we actually use, and there are some species you cannot use, and still they are important to us. And this is a lot about normativity. I mean, ultimately, it's the people or different groups who decide what's important for conservation and what is not. I mean, this is us. This is more about ethics or moral issues, and it's difficult to argue with like purely scientific arguments.
Yeah, I think for me, the most important part, we do work in very poor rural communities in Latin America and in the countries that we work with. And people have other issues that are more important to them, to get food, to get water. But then on the other hand, we see that climate change has a huge impact on these rural communities as well. There are a lot of droughts that are getting more increased. There are a lot of rainfalls that are getting more pronounced. So you get floods and then you get droughts again. And that's a lot has to do with climate change as well. Water supply is quite difficult for local communities, and then you get the direct linkage to forest conservation, because forests most of the times help to conserve water in the area when you have more produced drought periods. So forest conservation might be something that is very important for them in order to have their water supply. What we do in our project and what we work with our partners is to see what are the needs of the local communities that we work with, what is important for them. And water supply is one of the most important things that many communities identify in their areas. And then we work with them on how the forest in the region can contribute to achieve what they need. And that, I think, is a very strong linkage where we manage to get a direct link between forest conservation, water supply, and the alleviation of poverty, adaptation to climate change. And I think there are a lot of issues that one can identify locally, with the local communities, with the people on the ground, to see what are the needs and the necessities that they have, and how can that be combined with forest conservation or with biodiversity conservation. And I think that is the way to go, to really see where do people stand, what are their basic needs, and then help them find their ways to solve that. And I think that's the same, that are messages that you need to take to the political level, to not only talk about forest conservation or about carbon conservation, but also about the contributions that protected areas can have to development, that the protected areas can provide with adapting to climate change. And I think there are a lot of messages that we have to take on the policy level as well.
Okay, thank you. I would now like to give everyone the chance to give like a final short statement before we close this discussion. Yes, so maybe we can just start with you.
Yeah, I mean we've had some really interesting conversations, and I think that I guess what I'm taking away is that protected areas are still important, but there's different types of protected areas. We need to look at what the protected areas are going to be conserving, but we also need to look at the social issues as well, and we need to look at the future, look at 2050 and beyond, and try to start making that having those conscious discussions and conscious decisions. But I do still think that humanity will not, I hope. I still believe that humanity will really act to avert disaster. I hope.
Let's hope. Thank you.
So I'd like to follow on from what Sakhile just said, because it goes into the same direction as what I'm taking from this discussion, which is that we need to think about how we define the objectives of protected areas. Like Ali said, we have protected areas that were designed to protect certain species that will no longer be there. But does that mean that protected area is worthless, or does that mean we have to think about how we define the objectives of our protected areas, and whether how much of what the protected area can give to people is dependent on specific species, and how much is dependent on ecosystem functions. And I think also we need to, for example, when we think about the representativeness element of the IUCN targets, it's not just representative in terms of species list. I think we're going down the wrong track if we're trying to predict where we're going to have certain, if we're trying to design protected areas for the future by looking at projections of where species are going to be in 2050. I think that's the wrong way to take. So I think we don't need to change protected areas or the targets we have set ourselves for protected areas, because we know a lot of what is wrong with current protected area systems, that they're disconnected, they're not integrated with their surroundings, they have management issues. We know all this, so we don't need to change what we do, but we need to change what we're trying to achieve through what we're doing. I think that makes sense.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll just reiterate what I said earlier. Biodiversity conservation, protected area, we cannot see in isolation. We need to link it with human well-being overall and what's going around us, because that's how we resolve issues. But the first thing is we need to identify that there is an issue. Then we need to link it and move forward with it and work in an integrated manner. And poverty, without poverty reductions, things won't happen. And one last point to your religion, listening to something is different than acting upon it. 90% religious people, and the word we have, we can see.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that what I take from the discussion is that cultural issues are very important, and for me that is something that we see in our day-to-day work, that you really have to part from the culture that people have and from the uses that they do. You can't change people's life. Each of us know how difficult it is to change the habit that you have, to drink coffee every morning, or to change your daily life. And I think that is something that takes time. But when you get the right entry point, when you get the point of where you get people interested in what you're doing, or where you get people to see what are the benefits for them as well, then you can be quite successful. And for me, it is important to communicate protected areas as an important means to have a sustainable development of the whole world, and not only as something that we have to conserve this species of that important plant, which is in itself very important, but which might not be important to the people who live next to it. So you actually have to find the entry point of why is it important to have the protected areas, and what does it contribute to everyday life of the people that live around it, and of all the other people that can contribute to the conservation of the areas.
Yeah, I think what Elke just said is very important, highlighting the benefits of protected areas to people and societies. I'm not going to talk about that. Yeah, maybe I just want to raise one issue that we haven't discussed, which is monitoring. I mean, we talked about protected area effectiveness, and that there is still a lot to do. And I think, yeah, even if we don't know exactly what's going to happen under climate change, I mean, it's really important to continue the protection on the ground. It's for sure there will be changes, and I think we also have to embrace change. I think we cannot think that we can conserve the world or the species diversity as it is. There will be changes, and we can just try to manage change. And I think in order to understand what's happening, monitoring is very important. And I think a lot of protected areas, I mean, they don't do what they could be doing, because I mean, even if the protected area is managed, or if it's like a strictly protected area, it would be very important to have better data on what's happening in terms of species diversity, and what are the effects of different management interventions on species diversity and ecosystem functioning. Yeah, that would be helpful.
Professor Barthlott.
My main message would be to transmit that biodiversity and its protection is of benefit and important, because this is not generally accepted. If you go and talk to politicians, all these little quarrels about size of things, they just don't even understand its of importance. So that's one of our tasks, and all that. And the second, which is not our task, I think we have to get away from the fundamental assumption that growth is progress. And this is impossible even to transmit.
Okay, thank you very much. I would ask you to actually stay a bit longer. We have some lunch prepared outside, and I would invite you to have lunch there with us. There are also some posters about biodiversity and climate change issues that have been put up, and you can of course read them or not during your lunch break, and you can hopefully also interact with our panelists there further. Thank you very much.